A very warm welcome to our first session of an introduction into history of art. And we are going to look in the next weeks at a formal analysis of painting and also of sculpture later on. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Beatrice Harding. I am an Austrian, but I lived for 30 years in England, where I studied history of art and where I also taught for 12 years history of art at an English secondary school. History of art is in England also an A-level subject, a matura subject, and there's a really keen interest also in a promotion to study history of art at university. And I was also a member of the English Association of Art Historians, and as such we really try to promote the subject and to make it accessible to a wide range of possible interested people. And I hope I can introduce you as well. So why do we start with formal analysis? Formal analysis is really the backbone of understanding paintings, and also later on sculpture, and if there is the interest available also of architecture. We need the vocabulary because in order to get an understanding for the contextual side, for the aesthetic theory, there is such a kind of technical jargon which no one would understand to what it refers to if you do not have the basic understanding and vocabulary. So this is my aim, to give you and to provide you with an equipment, and from there we go together onto a journey. So I would like to start for this session today with composition. Composition is more or less the overall aspect of a painting, and in the future lessons we will go further and further into how to analyze a painting in more detail. It's almost like zooming in on different aspects. In view of composition, we need to consider the size, sometimes, and I only say sometimes, also the material, because we are looking at quite a wide range of materials and techniques. We also look at how figures within a composition, and with the time I provide you with different aspects to look at. Please bear in mind, sometimes there might be new vocabulary for you, which I maybe just brush initially a little bit because I want to focus on the compositional side, but which we are going to revisit and which I can explain to you in more depth on later occasions. Now, what is composition? Composition is how objects, colors, figures are arranged within a picture plane. It doesn't matter what kind of picture plane it is. So we also need to look at the size, because the size can sometimes be a little bit distracting, or it is very difficult for us to immerse ourselves into a work if we are not really being in front of it in situ. So sometimes I'm going to remind you that you need to bear in mind roughly the context of this. I also have envisaged to start a kind of chronological development starting with the early Renaissance in Italy, and our journey takes us throughout the examples which we are going to study into the second half of the 20th century, because I just thought it would be really lovely for you to get a feeling of a development of styles, which again we can discuss and come back to it at a later stage, but that you get just a feeling for how certain movements sometimes can 200-300 years repeat themselves, and where there's always a kind of counter movement, and where artists seek to break out of artistic conventions. So I'm standing here in front of you on a cold early March day. Snow is forecast for tonight, And I'm standing here in a really nice warm room. You sometimes may hear the fire flickering in the background, but I'm going to transport you to Florence, to a church called Santa Maria Novella, where you may find this fresco. Like I said to you, it is really important when we look at composition to consider the size of a work. When you look at the height of over 3 meters, you can work out roughly the size of the figures within the picture plane and how big the scale is in an upright format. Also, in that case, what is very important to point out is it is a fresco. So fresco, I can come to it on another occasion in more details, but it is more or less pigment painted directly after careful preparation directly on the wall. So consequently, you have to imagine, put yourself, we are in 15th century Florence, we are going into a church, we are going through the aisle, we see side chapels, and then we suddenly discover in one of the side chapels this particular fresco. And this fresco is like a door into a narrative. So it is very important that you understand it in that context. Also imagine, like this is the ground level and you are standing there. So roughly, if the painting is 3 meters high and you would be standing and an average person, you probably would be roughly on that level then, focusing on it. So you are below God the Father, but your feet are also where the skull is and the dead body in the coffin. But let us focus now on composition. So I mentioned to you the size of the work. Also, it can sometimes help you interpreting a narrative is the format. You speak of like this landscape format and like this of portrait format. It can vary sometimes from one work to the other, so do not be distracted by the expression portrait and landscape. But it can sometimes help you also to understand what is important maybe to the artist, why he or she chose this particular format. So we can, in some ways, maybe interpret the choice of the format also to enhance the verticality of the Trinity, God the Father, the Son. Here is the Holy Ghost. We have the Virgin Mary here, St. John the Evangelist, and here in front are what you call the donors. These are not religious figures, these have been people who lived in 15th century Florence and who commissioned the work. And below that here you have more or less another kind of reference to the element of death, which is already reiterated in the crucifixion. Coming back again to the kind of composition. So we know that there is a vertical emphasis, and the vertical emphasis is through a central vertical axis which runs throughout the picture plane. We also have a central horizontal axis which goes here through. So there's an absolute clear organization in this work. Also the way the figures are positioned is a way on how the narrative develops. The donors are in our world, and they have a respectful distance to the religious figures through this step. Then we have the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist, who are already in another sphere, and beyond you have the Trinity. We are going, at a later stage in another session, we are going to look more in details at stylistic characteristics, but the word Renaissance means revival, and we are speaking about the revival of classical antiquity. So we can recognize the revival of classical antiquity through the classical language of architecture. I will not want to distract you now with the different names for example, the different parts within the architecture, but it is again important to look at how the architecture is framing the composition. You will see the difference then in other examples which we are going to study later on. So we said we have a central vertical axis, and there are parallel vertical lines which are through the pilasters, through the columns on either side, and through the central bar of the cross, together with the arrangement of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. To a certain extent, the two figures on either side also enhance the verticality of the composition. Horizontality, we said, is the arrangement of the donors, the coffin below, with the dead body below, and we have here also the entablature with the different parts. So and the bar across here. So we have another line which goes above the heads of Mary and St. John. So there's this repetitive element of lines. It's a very, very clear organization. Nothing is off by chance. Also, and I invite you, when you have then the script in front of you, to take out a ruler, and you can really play this with other examples which we are going to discuss as well later on. If you follow these kind of lines on either side, you will see that they start merging at a vanishing point. So this is often the center or the most important aspect of a composition. It can vary from one work to the other, but it helps you when you look at, for instance, if there would be architectural features, to take lines like this here, which guide you all through the same point. It is another aspect is here that you do not have many colors. On another occasion, again, we go into more depth about colors, and we are going to use different examples, but you have it very monochromatic with the pilasters and the pillars, and then you have this repetitive color of the blue and the red. And when you see in this what you call a coffered ceiling, you have alternated red, blue, red, blue. You have God the Father who has red and blue. You have Mary and St. John the Evangelist who reiterated, and then you have it the opposite way around. So one part of composition is that there is a kind of, we need to look out for rhythm. Or there might not be a rhythm. And is it regular? Is it irregular? So let us summarize. One of the things of Renaissance, whether it's early or high Renaissance, is their thriving of creating harmony, balance, symmetry. And symmetry does not need to be literally complete symmetry, but a kind of order. It is also, this helps us from the stylistic point of view and from the composition point of view to interpret the painting, because we have a clear hierarchy here. And this sense of order and the kind of stability this order creates evokes in us something quite calming. And religion should comfort us in that context of the time. So again, I invite you to just imagine you enter the church, you see the side chapel, you're standing in front of it, and it is a window into all these kind of meditations through composition, and the composition is the first stance. Let us move now to the next example. This is also a Renaissance work, but it's Northern Renaissance. Very briefly, and again I will come back to it another time, this is an oil painting. And painting with oil was developed in Northern Europe and only later on started coming to Italy. What the oil helps is that one can do things in absolute precise sharpness if an artist wants to, but obviously when we look at 20th century art, it can be used in a very expressive way as well. Very, very different to the previous work. It is on a very small scale. And as you know, I have lived in England for a long time, and I often went to the National Gallery, and every time I was struck how much detail the artist was able to convey in this work on such a small scale. It is literally breathtaking. You may find here that they're actually quite, despite being a very different subject matter, it's a double portrait. It is also an interior setting. There's not directly a kind of religious subject matter, and I do not want to go now into the subject itself because we need to focus today on composition. But there are equally still things which we have discovered in the previous work. You may actually see there's a central vertical axis going throughout the painting. You have also a clear organization, what is on the left and on the right side of the picture plane. We have also, when you look here, can you remember the last time I told you, sometimes if you look out for certain lines, they literally take you to very important parts of the picture, which is here. So just the way the floorboards are is not accident, it's literally done out of compositional points. Now, despite having this regularity here, and that regularity I would like to point out, so we have the central vertical axis, we have vertical elements through, for example, the window pane, through the curtains here by the bed, but we have it also through, for example, the gesture of the man. We have horizontal, central horizontal axis, we have parallel horizontal lines going throughout the picture plane. Here, for example, yeah, or here. Now, another thing which is quite important is that we start looking out for shapes. I did not want to overload you with the first examples, but here it is worthwhile to start considering other elements which are important in a composition. Try to find shapes in an example. So we have, for example, here rectangular elements, we have circular elements, we have semicircular elements, we have here another circular element. They all relieve a little bit this angularity, the circular elements of the straight lines. So it's a certain relief, it brings in a new form. Another thing which is here important, and which we are going to see in other examples, you have an inverted pyramidal arrangement. Yeah? Imagine a pyramid, like a triangle, upright. So pyramidal arrangement would be if you have this kind of triangular shape. An inverted one is the opposite. And it guides us to the hands, which are the symbolic and compositional center of this particular work. Then, despite this kind of, there's something very formal in this composition, a little bit like we had the formality in the previous example. And here the artist tried to break a little bit of formality. So for instance, I'm not talking about the dog, because in some ways the dog is, for instance, also in the central vertical axis, but the way the slippers are being put here, the clocks are being put here, they are absolutely randomly put, and in some ways it takes away so this formality. So look out for elements like this in compositions. We did not have anything like this in the previous example, but here it makes it more natural, maybe more approachable. We will come back to this particular work on another occasion, so rest assured, because it is wonderful in view of the symbolism. But let us stay focused. Good. This is a high Renaissance work. This is again a fresco in Rome, in what is called the Stanze delle Segnature in the Vatican. The stanze were the private rooms of the Pope, and each room was dedicated to a particular theme. And the Stanze della Signatura was the room where the Pope had his library and also where he signed the documents, so hence signature from signature. It was also a room where he invited and welcomed people. This is just one of the frescoes in that room. You have to imagine it's an almost square room, and on each side you have a fresco, and each one is dedicated to a theme. This particular one is dedicated to philosophy, but again, there is so much symbolism and contextual aspects to be discovered, but we have to focus today on composition. Look at the size, 5 times 7 meters. It is on a colossal scale. Think about it now. 7 meters, here 5 meters high. The previous painting was, when we started looking at the Holy Trinity, the fresco, it was 3 meters high. So just think about how the ratio would have been. Everything here, just to bear in mind, is painted. Everything here. Here's a door. So the artist had to work out his composition around room elements. Here we have again a kind of interior setting, and very much like in the first 2 examples, a central vertical axis which goes through the painting, and we have a central horizontal axis here. We have also the architectural elements, and can you remember when I explained to you, take out a ruler? It comes back to features like this, and when you go here on the floor, it all comes to the same element. So actually where it's what you call the vanishing point is where the center of the composition is. In comparison to the formality of the 2 first examples, here we have so much more movement. And I would like to point a few other things out to you. So we have the central vertical axis. Verticality is enhanced by the figures standing on the top step, by the sculptures in the niches, by the architecture, which are the pilasters here, for example. So these are really strong vertical elements which are rhythmically and symmetrically reiterated throughout the composition. We have the central horizontal axis, which finds parallels, for example, here in the entablature, here in the steps. But if you look at how are the figures arranged, when you just think of a frieze spanning from one side to the other, the figures are in a frieze-like arrangement. This is another technical term. So the way they are spanning from one side of the picture plane to the other. Here you have so much more. So despite this kind of rigid architectural setting, and very interesting, it's also monochromatic, you have the contrast of the polychromatic figures, what they are wearing. And I invite you now to play a little bit. So for example, if you take just one color, let us start with blue. And we start here. And the blue takes us across the picture. So our eyes pick another color, yellow. So nothing is just off by chance. The artist really invites us to engage in very big depths, and we are not even looking at the context, at the subject matter. But again, he wants to disrupt a little bit the formality of the composition. And therefore, we have different groupings. So for example, we have here a grouping, we have here a grouping, we have someone taking notes, we have someone who is here very pensive, someone who is lying across, who guides us to to that here. So we have also this kind of different emotions suddenly expressed. In the two previous paintings, there were no emotions. Here, all the kind of humanity comes through. Happy, sad, calm, excited, all through this thing. This example is a high Renaissance example, and the difference between early Renaissance in Italy and the high Renaissance in Italy, that artists such as Raphael become much more confident, and this confidence is expressed in painting on a much larger scale. And their compositions, and I come back to the word compositions, is getting more and more complex. They feel much more at ease with themselves, much more secure. They have a technical mastery. And the other thing, which is a particular aspect of Raphael, it comes out in a very effortless way, as if it's just easy to do that. And when you think or consider how long a painting like this takes physically to paint on the wall, and the preliminary studies one has to do beforehand, it is really quite a masterly achievement. And let us move to the next example, something completely different. So this is a still life from Steenwijk. So this would come to the Dutch Golden Age. It's an allegory of the humanities, of human life. Again, it is something where we can discuss the subject matter on another occasion, but I want to focus here on the compositional arrangement. You may be struck that by contrast to the three other examples, everything is so much closer to us. So where we are and where we are invited to contemplate something, our position is really essential to absorb also a work. We have here a table which is parallel. So we have a landscape format, a table with an arrangement of still life. Again, it looks as if someone would just have dropped things on occasionally, and it just happened to be like this. No. We have the skull, which is slightly off center here and facing us. Can you remember when I mentioned to you beforehand, look out for shapes? So the table itself, this rectangular table, has quite sharp lines. And this rigidity and the simplicity of the table is enlivened by the complexity of the objects and the variety. So we have round shapes, oval shapes, we have diagonal lines. Diagonals, by the way, are often something which make a painting so much more dynamic. So even here we have, here with the book's diagonal lines, everything is crisscrossing. So with this absolute kind of symmetrical, harmonious organization of all the three previous works, it feels so randomly. One feels like there's a zigzag movement coming in, and then everything seems to be crammed to the right side of the picture plane. And it is almost like a triangle. But this triangle, which is so crammed, finds its reiteration in the empty space here. So again, the artist did not do that randomly, so it was really well thought through. In one of the next lessons, we are going to look also at about light and shades and the effects, but I would like to point out here, you have a shaft of light coming through, and it crosses here, it comes to the skull. So it almost creates here an inverted pyramid. So from that point of view, the light in itself on the skull highlights what is the most important aspect of the picture. There's a lot of symbolism in that, which we are going to discuss on another occasion. But again, I wanted to highlight to you how important it is that we start looking at a composition before we investigate the different layers. This is a neoclassical example. So we move now to the 18th century, late 18th century. And as you may see through the architecture, there seems to be a revival again of classical antiquity, which the name Neoclassicism invokes already. Here, again, we have certain aspects. We have a central vertical axis going through. The verticality is enhanced here by the columns, and to a certain extent here also by the walls. It's very framed, again, so it's very compressed within a picture plane. The stance here, this triangular stance, we have a rhythm. 1, 2, 3. We have 3 swords. We have 3 archers. We have 3 women. Again, this kind of rhythm coming through. The red, which is repeated, guides us also from one side to the other, so the white. But it's quite randomly put. When you think of the floor again, it takes us again to the kind of center of the picture plane. When you look at this here. One of the things which I would like to draw attention to you here, Neoclassicism as a revival of antiquity as well, can be quite stern, has often very harsh angular lines, and which is reiterated here, and it's very much about ethos and dignity and should be morally inspiring. I would like to take this opportunity here to introduce to you how through composition gender stereotypes are reiterated. Look at the men, straight lines, this kind of regularity. They're standing. And the women, everything is curvilinear. Linear, curvilinear, standing, sitting, round, soft, harsh. This is also part of the compositional element. Good. Now a landscape. After Neoclassicism, so the second half, it depends on the country and the artist, but after Neoclassicism, the beginning of the 19th century, we have Romanticism, and Caspar David Friedrich, whom you may know, a German artist, very famous German landscape artist, did this painting of a sea of ice. Friedrich has never been in the Arctic, but it's an Arctic sea, and he studied accounts, so he was very much taken by or inspired. We go from a very, very, very clear organizations which we had previously to suddenly bringing in different angles, harsh, irregular elements, asymmetrical elements, different layers. We almost feel, we can hear the cracking of the ice. And at the same time, he guides us so carefully to essential parts. Look at here, this would be like, we invited like stepping onto it, as if this would be a natural altar. And here, through triangular shape and through almost a divine line coming in, we have again this kind of triangle which often relates us also to the Trinity. So it's very open to our personal interpretation, but there's a kind of, despite this disorganization, you find again this kind of rhythm of the triangular elements being repeated throughout the picture plane. Something which not normally I would do at that stage, but which I find quite intriguing because the majority of the people never notice it. Can you see here? It's a ship, there's a shipwreck. And one does not see it in the first instance. And in some ways, all this disorder, the harshness of the composition, theoretically, Friedrich could have focused on that here, on the drama. But this here should not be here. This is an area where humankind should not approach. So it wants to enhance the aspect that humans tried to get into areas which are out of bound for them. Thank you. And now we move on. This is Impressionism. The Impressionists really discovered urban life, and the male artists were very fortunate in the sense of that they could capture really this urban life in its full glory. Women artists, they existed, and there's some really interesting examples. They're very restricted to the subject matter. So a respectable woman would not have been able to take sketches in a cafe and take this kind of scene in. You may now recognize certain things which we have mentioned beforehand. Interestingly, the protagonist, or one of the protagonists, is again in the central vertical axis. We have also a central horizontal axis. We have quite angular elements through the marble tabletops in a cafe. But then there's this sense of randomness coming through. We do not know, the tables appear to float. We do not see any kind of foot. Another aspect is also from where we see the work. It is as if we would be sitting here on the table and just look across. We have not seen this in any of the previous examples. Then you have this sense of order, for instance, the way they are sitting, the reflection in the mirror, but then these random elements of the newspapers, for instance. And the way the items are placed from where we are is what it wants to, in some ways, highlight, is this boredom, which can be also when one is in a big city. Also this isolation one can feel amongst a crowd. Something quite aimless about it. And this kind of focus of it enhances this kind of loneliness to a certain extent, because they do not even engage with each other. Coming back to shapes, there are, however, repeated shapes. We have the circular shape here, here, the bowler hat, here the hat, the ashtray here, but which are a little bit like a relief in contrast with the angularity of the table. Expressionism, Munch. Very famous painting. Is probably like the Mona Lisa, is one of these examples which we are just so familiar with in different versions. Here's something which Munch did. The figure, central vertical axis. We have here a composition which is 1/3 sky and 2/3 land. When you look here at this kind of pier going out into the fjord, very angular, very, very straight line, makes us actually quite uncomfortable. And these lines lead us to these figures. We do not see actually who these figures are. They are parallel to each other, crammed into this corner, and they are also very angular. And then we have the sky waving, the colors waving, the sea also, not the sea, but from the fjord, more or less, this kind of, one almost feels like one can hear the water movement. And this sense of movement starts here with this figure, with the position, and the scream one feels like is echoed through this kind of circular swirls of movement and is echoed then later on by the colors. Look at the contrast. So again, it is how through composition we do not even need to know the subject matter and where the location is, but how this kind of alienation of this screaming figure and this in some ways quite how shall I say, intimidating two characters there can be enhanced just through the linear and the curvilinear. So we're getting closer now to the 20th century. Here at the beginning of the 20th century, Pablo Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It's a very large painting. It is the first one where we have a square shape format. And when you look at the size again, so the figures here, the women, would be probably quite life-size or even larger than life-size format. We just think there is so a disruption again. And you might find it also very strange. So there's strong outlines here of the nudes. Then this absolutely contradictory edges. It doesn't make sense. There's this irregularity. Do we really know a kind of setting? Where is it taking place? Then you have these masks. It makes you really, really uncomfortable. This is one of the paintings which was extremely influential for the development of Cubism. And to maybe understand a little bit how the effect is, just imagine a picture painted on glass, and then someone would punch into the picture, but you have still all the shards not falling on the ground, but just having different angles. So they highlight all different things, so there is nothing balanced, symmetrical, harmonious. It is almost having a multiple perspective onto something. And in a certain way, women being exposed in the nude, in an environment like this, is already something quite uncomfortable. And to have this irregular surface, the different angles, almost enhance that on top of that. But do not think that it is just spontaneous and randomly. We have here still life, a table, an upside down table with a kind of small still life of grapes and a slice of melon. It is not accidentally. It's absolutely carefully placed here, because to a certain extent it invites us, as again, like in the gaswork, as if we would be sitting in front of it and actually focus onto that. Now for me, because we are in the Waldviertel at the moment, it is for me as if I would go through a young pine forest, through the thicket. And one never knows where one comes out, and one feels the harshness on the face. It is extremely important that you're aware again of the size. It's landscape format, over 5 meters. That's why I make the analogy like if you would be going into a young pine forest. Imagine you are just trying to go through and it envelops you on all sides. This is the effect of Pollock's work. Here, it's fairly monochromatic. he painted, having it on the ground, and then through dripping paint on it. We have the feeling it is just randomly, but when we are very careful, can you remember when I showed you in the School of Athens, when you just pick one color and how it guides you through the picture? Again, the way the white is, for example, distributed is not just in one area. It guides us again through it. And then, what is quite novel with this example is, where does it end? It takes us beyond the picture plane. We have again a sense of rhythm. Just look at it. We have thin lines, we have thicker lines, we have more condensed areas, we have much more open areas. It is really not randomly done. It gives us this sense of random, but it isn't. And it is really a work, despite us not giving us any narrative. It's almost like, let us fall into to invite us to fall into the work. And this is the last one. David Hockney, a British artist. This is a time when pop art started as well, during this time. Very, very different. After this abstract expressionism from Jackson Pollock, central horizontal axis. The way here, really rectangular shapes being reiterated throughout. We have here also a kind of, the trampoline is also rectangular. The swimming pool, it's almost clinical. It really makes you fast uncomfortable. Obviously it's a human inhabited, but you do not see any people. The palm trees, they almost feel like forlorn there. But in this kind of clear organization, outline, you have the splash, which is the focus. And you have lines, you have smudges, you have this kind of almost so smoky area. You do not see any person, you do not see any further ripples. It is literally just this amount. If the surrounding would not be done with such clear precision, with these lines, with the angularity, we would not notice the splash in such, and I would like to say, audible way. The longer we look at it, the more we feel like we hear it. So it was quite a very quick guide through many centuries to focus on composition, and you will get also some material so that you can look at the works in your own free time, where you have questions which you can ask yourself and try to go through the examples again and revisit them, where there certain terminology is more explained, and we will come back to many of the examples the next time when we are looking at three-dimensional depths and how it is conveyed, but we also look at other examples to enliven our journey. Thank you.